The world remembers Jimi Hendrix as the defiant, psychedelic demigod of rock and roll, the shaman draped in scarves and fringe, who made love and war with an upside-down Fender Stratocaster. This was the image forged in the sulphurous glow of the Monterey Pop Festival and the mud-soaked spectacle of Woodstock, a figure of supreme artistic freedom, unburdened by convention, an iconoclast to the core, whose sound was a direct challenge to the establishment. Yet, this incandescent persona of pure anarchy was born from the deepest well of regimentation and fear. Before the global stage and the velvet jackets, before the sound of feedback became the sound of a generation's revolt, there was a starkly different uniform, a rigid structure, and a deep, visceral fear of conformity that threatened to extinguish his nascent genius. James Marshall Hendrix, prior to his explosion onto the London scene, was an ordinary U.S. Army private in the 101st Airborne Division at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, during the years 1961 and 1962. This often ignored period of his life is not merely a biographical footnote, it is the crucible where his profound anti-authoritarianism was forged, and the true sound of his blues, the blues of being trapped, of being controlled, was born. It was here, in the cold, unyielding hierarchy of the military, that he learned the true meaning of the word escape. 1969, if you lived through that era, you understood the ever-present shadow of the Vietnam War and the suffocating anxiety of compulsory service. You remember the societal expectation of conformity, the pressure to fall in line, a rigidity that seemed utterly incompatible with the explosive freedom Jimi came to represent. The world knew Jimi Hendrix as a rock god who burned guitars, but behind the stage, he was still the solitary, deeply insecure young man whose only true escape had always been the neck of an instrument, a youth still haunted by the specter of a lifetime commitment to the machine he loathed. The ebullient, theatrical stage persona was, in part, a grand rejection of the disciplined, regimented existence the army had tried to impose. But then, in London on that last fateful night, as years of hidden recordings and fragmented testimonies finally began to surface, the story transformed into something far larger than just Jimi's tragic end. It became clear that the Army's lessons, the psychological toll of being controlled, the learned necessity of finding loopholes, had fueled his entire, explosive, and ultimately short career. The other musicians and managers who were there, those who had seen the real, unvarnished Jimi, began to whisper details. The secrets he carried from his military service, the fear, the isolation, the sheer relief of his honorable discharge, were the hidden engines of his relentless pursuit of musical anarchy. 3 signatures, one on an enlistment paper, one on a management contract, and one lost in the haze of his final night, determined the trajectory of his myth. As the morning of September 18, 1970, approached, the clock was ticking. Within hours, Jimi would either finally achieve the creative and financial freedom he craved from the industry's contracts, a different kind of imprisonment, or his name would be sealed forever into an irreversible, dark mythology. The decision to enlist in 1961 was not driven by patriotism or a sudden desire for military life, it was a desperate maneuver to avoid a much harsher alternative. James Marshall Hendrix, then barely 19, had been caught twice riding in stolen cars in Seattle. A judge, offering a choice often handed to young men with few options, presented him with an ultimatum: 2 years in prison or 2 years in the army. The choice was clear, but the commitment was a terrifying form of subjugation for a spirit as inherently rebellious as his. He traded the rigid authority of the courtroom for the absolute, unforgiving command of the United States Army's elite 101st Airborne Division. This was not just a desk job, this was a jump school, an elite, demanding unit where the mantra was precision, obedience, and self-sacrifice. Perhaps you, too, spent your youth in a small room, rewinding a Jimi solo on a scratchy cassette tape again and again, trying to unlock the impossible secret of his sound, a sound that was, at its root, the sound of a man breaking free from rigid commands and forced conformity. The rigid structure of Fort Campbell, Kentucky, was the ultimate antithesis to the chaos and fluidity that defined his musical soul. He was forced into the ultimate state of conformity: shaved head, standardized uniform, a strict schedule dictated by the bugle. This was the exact opposite of the artistic life he craved. His primary goal became simple: survival and finding any means possible to hold on to his identity. Yet, even within the confines of the barracks, the musical spirit could not be entirely suppressed. His one sanctuary was his guitar. The battered, non-amplified electric guitar he kept in the barracks became his confessional. His bunkmate, and later longtime bass collaborator, Billy Cox, remembered the constant, feverish practice sessions. Jimmy would sit, often isolated, his left hand attacking the upside-down fretboard, already finding complex rhythms and chord voicings that were far beyond standard blues or R&B. The pressure of the training was immense, the risk of deployment, Vietnam was ominously looming, was constant, and the physical demands were punishing. Jimmy, often described by his superiors as awkward, clumsy, and disorganized, struggled severely with the meticulous rigidity of military life. He was a disastrous parachutist, constantly finding ways to fail the training standards. His inherent lack of coordination and inability to maintain formation were often cited in official reprimands. The Army demanded a clean efficiency, Jimmy was pure, inspired sloppiness. 100,000 fans might be cheering, but in the narrow corridor backstage years later, Jimmy would stand, cigarette burning, asking the same question over and over, "Is it still mine? Am I still in charge of the show, or am I still taking orders?" This sense of perpetually taking orders, of being a cog, applied directly to his identity. The Army tried to strip away the James Marshall and replace it with a unit number, a process he resisted with every fiber of his being, channeling that resistance directly into the strings. The music he created during this 18-month stint in the Army was a profound, raw form of the blues of confinement, of frustration, and of deep-seated resentment toward authority. It was here that he began to cultivate the distinctive playing style that would become his signature, intense, complex, and utilizing every part of the fretboard, always searching for a way out of the 12-bar box. The segregation and intense cultural conservatism of the early 1960s South only amplified his isolation. He was a black man in a strictly hierarchical, largely white institution during a period of intense racial tension, adding another layer of deep-seated unease to his experience. He felt like an alien figure, his flamboyant tendencies and artistic sensitivity completely at odds with the macho, rigid environment. His method of coping was to practice relentlessly. He and Billy Cox formed a small band called the King Casuals, playing in the few off-base clubs that would hire them. This was a crucial duality: by day, the rigid discipline of the paratrooper; by night, the release of electric rhythm and blues. This constant, brutal contrast between regimentation and release fueled his creative fire. He learned how to compartmentalize the fear and transform the frustration into sound. The blues he played here was not the polite Chicago style, it was a loud, desperate, guttural sound of a young man desperate for freedom, channeling the anxiety of potential deployment into every note. The inevitable escape came in the form of a badly broken ankle, sustained during a parachute jump in May 1962. The circumstances of the injury are themselves a subject of debate. Was it a simple accident, or a subconscious manifestation of his deep desire to be released? Regardless of the cause, the resulting injury was severe. It was an injury that, according to his medical discharge papers, rendered him permanently unsuitable for duty, specifically citing his inability to perform the rigorous duties of a paratrooper. His early discharge from the Army, an honorable discharge he received in mid-1962, was, for Jimmy, a monumental, life-defining moment, a definitive, blessed escape from the control of the state. It was a lifeline that allowed him to pursue his true destiny, unburdened by the looming shadow of Vietnam. He left the Army determined never again to be controlled by an external force. This military experience fundamentally shaped his anti-authoritarian sound and his absolute commitment to self-expression. He would dedicate his life to resisting the structural forces that sought to contain him. Years later, a studio engineer would admit that the one sentence Jimmy whispered after they stopped the tapes one night still woke him up from a sound sleep. That sentence, rooted in his military anxiety and his fear of any commitment, was simply, "Am I going to be called back? Is this freedom real?" It spoke to the trauma of control that never fully left him. The new uniform, the industry. Upon leaving the army, Jimi plunged into the unforgiving world of the R&B Chitlin circuit, first in Nashville and then touring with legends like the Isley Brothers and Little Richard. He was free from the government's control, but he quickly found himself shackled by a new, more insidious form of authority, the music industry. The rigid structure of the R&B sideman, where you played exactly what you were told, wore the prescribed uniform, and never, ever outshone the star, was merely the military's conformity in velvet and sequins. It was an invisible structure of command that demanded obedience for a paycheck. The early contracts he signed, often in hurried, naive circumstances, were predatory, giving away publishing and management rights that he would spend his entire career trying to reclaim. The financial and artistic constraints of this new system became the war he could never truly win. This ongoing legal nightmare, this fight for autonomy, was the psychological echo of his time at Fort Campbell. He was perpetually fighting the feeling of being owned, whether by the army, by a manager who took all his publishing rights, or by the record executives who demanded predictable hits. The love letters written by one of the women who drifted in and out of his life slid under his door during the darkest days of his career, a fragile lifeline of genuine human connection he often couldn't grasp, overshadowed by the constant, exhausting battle for control. His dramatic arrival in London in 1966, facilitated by Chandler, launched him into a stratosphere where the rules seemed broken. But beneath the surface, the business machine quickly adapted. He was marketed as the wild man of Borneo, an exotic, unpredictable force. His stage antics, playing with his teeth, behind his back, making love to the amplifier, were viewed by the public as pure, joyful anarchy. In reality, they were a sophisticated form of spectacle as resistance. If the industry demanded spectacle, Jimi would give it to them, but he would make it so extreme, so unique, that he would transcend the expectation and momentarily reclaim control of the narrative. The ultimate expression of this calculated defiance was the burning of his Stratocaster at Monterey in 1967. To the audience, it was the ultimate act of rock confidence and sacrifice. To Jimi, it was the destruction of a physical object he was perpetually ordered to use. He later recounted that the moment of the flames was one of the few times he felt genuinely free on stage. But this freedom came at a price. The world now expected fire, both literally and figuratively, at every single show, chaining him to his own theatrical genius. The irony was painful. The performance of freedom became a new, rigid command. The constant, relentless touring, 3 albums in 2 years, hundreds of shows, was a deliberate management tactic designed to generate the enormous revenue required to service the debt and fight the legal battles over his restrictive early contracts. On the back pages of the record company agreements were clauses that no one in the industry ever wanted to read aloud, the secret mechanism that kept the star in constant debt and obligation, forcing him onto the endless tour bus, the new army transport. He was an economic prisoner, and the pressure of being the world's greatest guitarist, the pressure to be constantly on, the spectacle, the expectation of sonic anarchy, demanded an energy he could not sustain indefinitely. He increasingly turned to drugs and alcohol, not just for pleasure, but as a way to cope with the relentless anxiety and exhaustion. The exhaustion was the same bone-deep fatigue he felt during his most strenuous days in the army, amplified by the noise and the constant travel. When the spotlight hit him, Jimi sometimes felt for the first time that his fingers were not entirely his own, that the music was being played through him by a force he no longer controlled, a feeling that harkened back to the impersonal nature of military command, an entity using his body to execute orders. This fear of loss of self was the ultimate legacy of Fort Campbell. The later albums, particularly the sprawling, complex Electric Ladyland, 1968, reflect this internal tension, a struggle between the chaotic freedom the world expected and the quiet, searching musician within. He desperately needed space and time to evolve, but the machine demanded constant, profitable output. His confession to his closest confidants about a long-hidden childhood memory was, in reality, the true starting point of his emotional breakdown, suggesting a deep-seated need for control and emotional safety that the chaos of his career, and the looming contract battles, denied him. His desire to build Electric Lady Studios in New York was his ultimate attempt to create a sanctuary, a private space where he could finally be free from external command. It was meant to be his peaceful anti-barracks, where he could be his own commander-in-chief, dictating the schedule, the sound, and the personnel. The studio was intended to be his escape route from the tyranny of the clock and the contracts. The summer of 1970 found Jimi physically and spiritually drained. The European tour was a chaotic final act, plagued by exhaustion, poor sound, and his visible struggle with dependency. He was trapped in a financial and physical loop. The enormous cost of Electric Lady Studios, his sanctuary, had created a debt that forced him to keep touring, thus destroying the energy he needed to actually use the studio. The escape had created a bigger chain. His last public performance, at the Isle of Fehmarn in Germany, was a disaster, technical glitches, a restless crowd, and a moment where he simply walked off stage, unable to continue. He was done. That single final night would prove to be a breaking point that would forever change how the rock music industry viewed the artist and the physical toll it took on their being, forcing a conversation about the human cost of global fame. His time in the army had taught him how to endure command, his time in rock and roll taught him how command could kill. The last week of his life in London was marked by a desperate, palpable search for quietude. He made several final phone calls to friends and former associates, expressing his profound fatigue and his urgent, simple need to get off the road and focus on his studio work. The desire for a normal, peaceful, creative life had eclipsed the desire for fame. He was trying to execute his final, most important command, retreat. The night of September 17, 1970, in the Samarkand Hotel apartment, was the culmination of these pressures. The official cause of his death was asphyxia due to aspiration of vomit while intoxicated with barbiturates. The confusion and lack of clarity surrounding the events of that final night only emphasized his isolation. He died alone, trapped in a small, foreign room, far from the sanctuary he had built. The tragedy was the final, devastating irony: a soldier who hated confinement died by being confined and unable to breathe. Jimi Hendrix died a victim of both his genius and the unforgiving system that monetized it. The confusion and lack of medical clarity in the aftermath only fueled the narrative that the industry was sloppy with its gods. The tapes that emerged after his death revealed a secret that had been kept for years, a vast archive of unreleased material, demonstrating a creative depth that went far beyond the hits, proof that Jimi was still evolving, still searching, still reaching for a sound that was always just beyond the horizon. These recordings, often acoustic and introspective, are the final echoes of the quiet man who hated the noise of command. His life was a perpetual battle for autonomy, beginning with the judge's order and ending with the final, tragic inability to control his own physical state. He used the amplified Stratocaster to scream out the blues of a soldier who found his freedom, only to discover that the world of rock and roll had built a bigger, more demanding cage. His legacy is the music, a raw, beautiful sound that stands as the eternal anthem of resistance against any force that seeks to command the human spirit.